and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. My name is Leslie Hawthorne. I'm one of our fabulous co-hosts, and I'm joined today by Ben Cotton. Hi, Ben. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Leslie. How are you?
I am very well, thank you. And I want to thank you again for your patience while we had to consistently battle respiratory ailments in order to be able to record this episode. It has been a long time coming, and it's going to be fabulous. Wonderful humans listening to this podcast. I'm pleased to let you know that Ben is currently the open source community lead at Kasari, and he previously led open source strategy and messaging at Docker. And prior to that was the Fedora program manager at Red Hat for 5 years, which is where we got to know each other. Ben's career has taken him through public and private sector roles, including desktop support, high performance computing administration, marketing, and program management. He is the author of Program Management for Open Source Projects, contributed to the book Human at a Distance, and has also written articles for The Next Platform, opensource.com, Scientific Computing, and more. Ben lives in Lafayette, Indiana, a city he forgot to leave after graduating from Purdue University with a Bachelor of Science in Synoptic Meteorology and a Master of Science in IT Project Management. If you're feeling brave, you can follow him on social media, including Mastodon, LinkedIn, or even read his personal website. We will have links to those in the show notes. And now that we have read your lengthy and auspicious bio, we are here to talk about all things sustaining open source. So, my first question for you is, since you in fact wrote the book on program management for open source projects, can you tell us a little bit about the book, who the audience is, why we should all run out and buy it immediately and read it?
Well, I think any author, if you get them to give you a moment of frankness, will say they wrote a book because they wanted to see their name on the cover. That was certainly true for me, right? It had been my goal for a long time to have written a book. And finally, I came along with what is something that people might actually care about and something that I know enough to write about. And so writing program management for open source projects was in large degree me talking about how I did my work as the Fedora program manager. I'd seen what my friend John O. Bacon's The Art of Community did for community management, community architects, whatever, like that kind of space. And it was my hope that it would serve as a parallel for that in terms of the day-to-day sort of engineering work of open source projects, not necessarily like the actual code writing, but the how do you get all these different groups of people to work together in a way that actually produces an operating system every 6 months or whatever your project, makes. One of the interesting things about Fedora and so many other open source projects is that there's a mix of people who are there because it's their day job and maybe they don't actually care about it that much, except they want to keep getting their paycheck. And there are people who are there because it's really important to them and they're donating their precious free time to help build this thing with your community. And so the more smoothly you can make all those interactions run, the more respectful you are of people's time. And really, when it comes to volunteer-driven projects, like that is the most valuable resource you have, because people give you their time and you can't give it back to them if you decide later on you didn't need it. Once you've given it, it's gone. So I wanted to give a starting point for people like, all right, well, there's nothing like you must do this, this, this. It's like, all right, here are the concepts to think about. What applies to your project, but like do things with intention. Have a reason for why you're setting up processes, why you're doing the things you do. And so that it's predictable and so that things work better. And there wasn't really a book in that space. There are a lot of books that sort of touched on some of the things. Karl Fogel's Producing Open Source Software is probably the best example. And that's a tremendous resource, but it doesn't quite cover the same things that I was trying to get at. I was like, okay, well, there's this gap in the published knowledge. And I have a lot of experience doing this every day. I think Fedora is the only open source project I know of that has like a engineering program manager role formalized. And that's the thing I say early on in the book. It's like everybody's already doing this work. It's just a question of, are they aware that they're doing this work and are they being intentional about it?
As a fellow engineer of human systems, I laud and applaud your daily work and the fact that you've taken the time to document it and give people a guidebook. I am delighted to see that Karl Fogel has in fact produced the second edition of Producing Open Source Software, which is fantastic. I need to actually read it. I have the first edition somewhere on these lovely bookshelves behind me. I find that some of the best folks that I see doing community management, community architecture, architecting of human systems are people who got deeply passionate about a particular problem space, but then stayed because they were excited about the humans they were working with and improving all of those human processes so that more great work got done, be that producing software, be that creating your local community of artists, all that other good stuff. How did you end up working in open source communities if you studied synoptic meteorology? And what is synoptic meteorology anyway?
Synoptic meteorology is basically like what you think of when you think of weather, right? It's like the medium scale thunderstorms, cold fronts, warm fronts, things like that. It's called synoptic. It's kind of distinguished between like tropical meteorology or cloud microphysics, things like that. So it's sort of like the general meteorology. So my career trajectory is kind of interesting. My freshman year in college, there was a professor who was giving a tour of the department, and he showed us around the computer lab, and he said, by the way, Wednesday night, I'm doing a 2-hour training session on how to use our weather software. Show up if you want to come. And I was like, yes, making maps. That is why I'm here. So I went and I learned how to use, we were using like FreeBSD 4 at the time for our computer lab. And we had this command line based weather map generation tool. And I learned how to make cool maps. And I was really excited by that. And then at the end of the session, he said, I'm a visiting professor. My appointment's up at the end of the year. I don't know who's going to be maintaining this stuff next year. So I go back to my dorm room and I sit down, and in a burst of confidence, I send an email that says, and I quote, I'm just a freshman who doesn't know what he's doing, but I'll do it. And the department must have admired my audacity. So they hired me as a student to maintain our weather data ingest and visualization software. You know, this was all produced externally, so I didn't have to write any of it. I was just sort of like the application administrator, but got my foot in the door. And then around the time I was graduating, I had also started picking up some extra hours, slinging furniture around, repainting offices, whatever it could take to fill out my time card. And so when shortly after I graduated, I had stayed on as a temporary service appointment over the summer. And then the Unix admin in the department taken to another job. And so the department was like, Ben, we know you're not a computer expert, but you understand the science and you work well with our faculty and stuff. Apply for this job, please. And so they hired me. And I looked at my offer letter and said, wow, this pays twice as much as going to the National Weather Service would. And I don't have to work midnight shifts. Cool. I'll just work in technology instead. Weather's a great hobby. It's always out my window. So I could still use this degree. And so by that point, most of our Linux machines were running RHEL 3 or RHEL 4. We had some Fedora Core 1 machines around here and there. And so all of a sudden, here I am. I'm a professional system administrator now. And I was like, I need more skill. I need more experience. So I converted my machines at home to run Fedora. And after a while, I was like, I'm getting all this stuff for free. Like I felt this sort of this obligation to give back in some way. And I thought about like, all right, what can I do in the community? Don't really know how to code. I do know system administration, but Fedora's infrastructure is a lot more complicated than the stuff I was working on. And I said, okay, well, there's a documentation team and I make words good. So like, why not start there? So I joined the Fedora docs team and started making some friends. And to your point, I wasn't necessarily super passionate about it. I was interested in it. I thought it'd be a good resume boost, but I met some people very early on, the most welcoming community. And here's this guy who just shows up one day and says, I would like to help, please. And they're like, here, let us take time to walk you through how our tool chain works. Here's how you learn DocBook XML and all these things. And I stuck around because the community was great. I always struggle, like, should I mention names? Because I know I'm going to forget people, but Karsten Wade, Jared Smith.
We
Paul
love you,
Frields,
Karsten.
All of these people, they were just like there and super welcoming, and they didn't have to be, but that was the choice they made for their communities. We're going to be welcoming of new people. And so once you get people to stick around, eventually it's like, oh, here's a package I could maintain. Let me do that. And slowly you start doing more and more. And then I found myself leading the docs team for a while because nobody else was going to step up and do it. And I got more involved in the community, and eventually Red Hat hired me for a program manager role.
One of the things that I have found interesting, having been doing this whole open source software gig now for almost 20 years, is the stories of folks who were just starting in communities around the same time I was, and how many of us have a very similar story, right? Something that was interesting. It wasn't necessarily the most super passionate topic, but it was something we definitely wanted to get our hands around. We got in, and it was the people that made us stay and actually gave us motivation to grow our additional skill sets so that we can contribute even more to the community, being that like getting into doing software development or leading a documentation team, which is a different skill set than just writing the docs individually yourself. Based on seeing how things evolve over time, do you think how people get engaged in project communities has changed and evolved?
I am super glad you asked me that question, because that topic's been on my mind the last few days. I think there is a shift. And now that I've been around open source for 15 years, it's a little hard for me to be like, oh, this is what the newcomer experience is like. I think in a lot of ways, the projects people are more likely to engage with are a lot more well-structured, a lot more formalized. But I think that also then puts up barriers that we didn't intend to have. It used to be that you could find the source code for the software you wanted to poke at it a little bit, build it locally, see if it worked, et cetera. Now, for a lot of things, it's like, all right, well, first install these 30 packages from NPM or wherever. And then you've got this huge Kubernetes cluster that you have to mock up locally or run locally. And software has gotten more complicated. And that makes it harder for people who are just sort of interested, but not fully interested. It makes it harder for them to join in. I think, on the other hand, we are so much better as an ecosystem at understanding that how we treat each other matters. I've not been an active participant on the Linux kernel mailing list ever, but I have heard enough from people who are, or seen the articles written about so-and-so flamed this person for their bad thing. And Linus Torvalds has certainly changed how he talks about what the Linux community is like. And there does seem to be a shift in the temperature there. Most projects now have a code of conduct. Many of them are reasonable to more than just now, be nice, which is well intended, but not necessarily very effective. We are becoming more aware that our fellow open source contributors are actual humans and not just digital representations of magic. But as we record this, there was just a post on LinkedIn the other day about Tidelift's maintainer survey showing that over the last few years, the center of the distribution of ages in open source contributors continues to shift older. And at some point, many of us are going to want to put the keyboard down and hit the beach for the day. And we have to make sure that we are bringing along that next wave of contributors. I don't know that there's an easy answer for it, but it's something that we definitely need to be aware of. Are we bringing new people in, and then are we retaining them? Because those are two separate questions, and they have very different solutions to addressing them.
I'm with you. Having spent a decent amount of my career thinking about getting newer contributors into open source software projects, I noticed the same, the general trending towards older skewing. And I think part of it has to do with the ways in which open source projects have gone through that, for lack of a better term, professionalization that you were talking about, right? Like once upon a time, you rock up to a project's community, you get involved in their version control system, you read whatever documentation there may or may not be, you send notes to an email list. And now it's evolved to, we have systems like GitHub that allow people just kind of come through and peruse. And we may now not even have any kind of real-time chat system. People are using forums, and there's just different ways to engage, different ways that people want to communicate. And as we see more and more people doing their development and say things like software foundations, which I think are great structures for establishing governance, making it really clear what the rules of engagement are, what are the processes to get engaged in a particular working group, take a position of leadership, what is the expectation for what a leader provides to that group. It's all very formalized, which I think is valuable, but it definitely means that wide accessibility isn't necessarily there, because a lot of software foundations are mostly projects that are folks who are paid to be there by their employer, and they may be passionate about the technology or maybe not. One of the things that I also think is really weird, and this is going to get into another topic that I know is hot on your mind because you and I have talked about it, is as we're seeing more and more emphasis on machine learning and programming for generative AI solutions or just plain old AI solutions that are not generative, I see there being a lot less capacity building for engagement in open source software as we see more and more work done in the AI space called open source, but it doesn't in fact provide the same mechanisms for engagement that you and I understand intimately as being required for open source, right? No field of use restrictions on the technology or being able to contribute back to the software systems that you're using instead of them being only produced by a specific company that then provides outputs at its source available, but there's nothing that you as a user of that software can do to contribute to how it's developed. And that bugs me. And I think it doesn't just bug me because I'm an old fuddy-duddy or like an open source software purist and an ex-open source initiative board member. Like I fundamentally feel that that's a paradigm shift that is not positive. It's lacking in the inclusivity that we at least strive for as participants in open source projects in the past. And I'm trepidatious that this will cause there to be a generational gap of experts as we continue seeing the evolution of technological progress towards things like large language models and other machine learning systems.
It's interesting you bring that up because back to the previous topic, one of the things that I've thought about is a few years ago, I bought a new laptop. I put Fedora Linux on it and everything worked. The wireless card, the Bluetooth, the webcam, the speakers. And I was like, cool. And then I was like, oh, wow, we've come a long way. Because when I first started using Linux, and I was by no means an early adopter, right? But it was hard, especially if you weren't using that group of well-supported hardware. If you had newer hardware that nobody had written the drivers for yet or whatever. And I remember I had a faculty member who had some extra large displays because he was looking at seismic data and had all these cool visualization stuff. So he needed some, at the time, pretty fancy NVIDIA cards. And I remember having to like manually edit the mode line to get X11 to work right with those. And like now you don't have to. And I think, on the one hand, that is amazing. That is what we want. Computers should just work and they should be out of our way so that we can do the thing we want to do with them. But we have lost that, wow, this software is being a pain in my butt. Let me go see if I can fix it. It's not as tinkerable as it used to be, which is in general good, but does make it harder to get people interested because I think most people get started because they're personally insulted by the computer and they want to avenge themselves. My wife and I were talking about this last night, and fairly conflict averse with people. But if an inanimate object wrongs me, I am the most stubborn person alive. I will sit there until it bends to my will. And I think AI systems are just sort of an extension of what we've seen with the applianceification of technology in general. I wouldn't call myself an open source purist, but I think there are a lot of advantages to open systems, especially the more responsibility and agency we give to AI systems. We start using them for identifying suspects in criminal cases and things like that. We absolutely need to know what biases are in there. But at the same time, for most people, they don't actually care if the thing does what they want them to do. And I don't think they should have to care. And so like, it's kind of hard. Like, how do we make sure that these systems, because like openness for me isn't the end goal, right? The openness is the way we achieve the human goals of being able to trust the software, being able to verify that what we're doing. And I think sometimes there are certain longstanding organizations who have over-rotated onto their definition of freedom as being the end goal and losing sight of the humans that are actually using it on the end. And so I think generative AI in particular presents a really interesting challenge for us because we want to have that ability to verify things. How do we come up with a definition and potentially legislation or just self-regulation, to the extent that actually works, to make sure that we are preserving these things that are important to people.
I spent a lot of time thinking about this because on the one hand, I now live in a country where people are very focused on mechanisms put in place by governing bodies that may be biased, disenfranchise people, and lead to seriously bad outcomes. Hello from Germany. And yet at the same time, as the mother of a visually impaired child, I see this incredibly beautiful, bright future before us in which my daughter can pick up any device. She doesn't care about repairing the device. She's not going to have the capacity to repair the device. She can't see the circuits, right? And to be able to say, I would like to read a book about synoptic meteorology, because my mom was just telling me that she was talking to her buddy, Ben, and he's a synoptic meteorologist, and that the device will literally be able to locate the work, give her a couple of different options of the work and tell her which one was written more recently and may have new innovative points to make, and then be able to read that work back to her. And I have so much joy in that bright future. And at the same time, there's this thing in the back of my brain that says, if we start giving folks that kind of instant gratification when it comes to accessing all information, is everybody just going to suddenly lose everything that we think of as the spark of their humanity or their bits of creativity or even their curiosity? Because how often do we just go with the first thing that we see because we're trying to get that instant gratification or a quick answer, or just to be able to move along in our life because the pace of our existence has rapidly sped up the more technological innovation has been in our lives? And these are hard questions, right? I think that there's something that we as humans need to ruminate about as our technology evolves. And I am hopeful that we will continue to see more of that ruminating and consideration and thoughtfulness about impacts and choices we're making. And as we come into having systems start to make decisions that don't have a human in the middle in any way, shape, or form, that are deeply impactful to people's lives. Things move so fast and there's so many great things about it. Like, I love having a little computer in my pocket. And I remember the day when it was like the world was shown the iPhone. Now, sometimes I work with kids who have like never not had a cell phone. And I'm like, how did this happen? And yet the implications are not always positive. Technology is neutral. The application of it is not neutral. Supposedly goes the phrase, taking the words that you started this conversation with, being more intentional about our choices and being more intentional about how we make decisions that are not necessarily driven by immediate gratification or even immediate profitability returns, but create something that is of lasting value to the human species, if this is the direction we're going to go in.
Yeah, it's funny because like one of the things that I've come to realize over the years is that I should have taken a lot more like philosophy and ethics classes in college. Because you're talking about, is this quest for instant gratification? What does that mean for us as a species? And this is not a technology question, right? This is ultimately a, what does it mean to be human question? And we just do not think about that enough. We don't think about the ethics of what we're doing. And most people who don't think about the ethics of what they're doing, and I'll lump myself into that category most of the time, we're not intentionally saying to hell with it. We want to do well, but it's not part of the curriculum for most people. And it's not something that as a society we've put a lot of weight on. And so there's no reason that people should be like, oh, of course, let me think about that. And so that's kind of one of the things that I'm thinking about is like, why are we doing this technology stuff? And I try really hard to think, all right, we're doing this cool work with computers to what end? And to your point, my kids just have no concept of what life was like when I was their age or a little bit older. The idea of having paper maps, or I remember the first time I was in a hotel room with my daughter and she had only ever known Netflix as a source of television. And we're sitting there and a PBS station is on TV while we're getting dressed. And she watched an episode of something that she liked. And she's like, I want to watch another one. I was like, sorry. And she's like, can you pause it? No, I can't. The world that people of our generation makes total sense. Why you use your thumb and your pinky finger to make a phone call sign. Why there's that weird little square when you want to save something. These all make sense to us. And the world now is incredibly different in a lot of ways, but humans are the same. And we have to figure out what is that important part. The example you shared with your daughter and like being able to point at a device and be like, here are the books on this topic, and here's the ones that are good to read, and here, let me help you read it. That is incredible. I love the application of AI for that kind of thing. I hate the application of AI for like, let's produce some words, because the words are not necessarily reliable. They're not human, and maybe it's more efficient, but I think that's only because we've externalized all the costs. And this is one of the downsides of having that meteorology background is I think about the weather a lot, and I think about what will the weather be like in 20, 30, 50 years? What will my kids and my grandkids live to experience? And in the last few years, we've seen a lot of companies who had very ambitious climate goals going the wrong way. And as Western society in particular, but humanity in general, we are doing a very bad job of continuing to give ourselves a habitable home. And I think flinging ourselves at another planet is probably not the most sustainable option for us.
I'm going to say one of my favorite phrases of late. I find it deeply concerning that it seems like a lot of the people who are making decisions about the future of humanity and our planet are folks who, by all accounts, get together annually at Burning Man, do the same designer drugs, and group hallucinate that Westworld is an instruction manual. And I would like that to not be how we make decisions. But, I have lots of hopes and desires, and hopefully some of them will even come to pass. So I am in complete agreement with everything that you just said. It also is starting to feel a little heavy in my heart, and I would like us to have more fun things to talk about, because I think that there are many people like us who worry about that. And maybe we don't want to remind them of their existential dread during sustain, because this is about sustaining, not about having angst. But I guess we can have angst later. So I want to loop back really quickly to a question that came in from our dear colleague, Richard, who is ill, so he couldn't join us. And he was texting me saying that he wasn't feeling well. And I said, can you jot down the questions that you had Ben here for me? And he said he was interested in particular in your view on program management and open source software projects. And how does the project manager role differ from a good developer who is also trying to think about like program and project management aspects as part of their work?
One of the ways that all roles really in open source are different from, say, their corporate counterparts. In the corporate world, typically, everybody has a job. So you're a developer, or you're a project manager, or you're a product manager, or you're doing QA, or you're a technical writer. But you show up, you do one of those things, and then you go home. In open source projects, people wear many hats. And so one day you might sit down and implement that new feature you've been wanting to do for a long time. The next day you might produce a design document. The next day you might write the documentation for that cool new feature you did, et cetera. And so I don't think that a well-organized developer who can interrelate with people is really any different, because project and program managers aren't like different classes of people. They're just different work that we do, right? And I think for most projects, a sufficiently organized developer is going to be the de facto project program manager, because one, you don't have a lot of program managers banging on the doors of projects saying, please let me help you. And you don't have a lot of projects saying, gosh, we really want some Gantt charts and stuff. So I think the big difference then is like thinking about what role am I acting in right now? Am I acting as a developer, or am I acting as a program manager? And if it's the latter, you have to sort of take the broader view of how do all these pieces fit together for this particular release in this particular moment, but also like how do things fit together for doing the next release and the release after that? How are we building sustainable processes within the community to do the work efficiently together? And so the main difference is just sort of like, are you being kind of myopic on this section of code that's on your screen right now? Or are you thinking about the holistic view? And both are important. Like you can't have a holistic view if nobody's working on the details, but you have to just be aware, like, which of these am I do I need to be doing right now? And am I, wearing the right glasses to see the things that I need to be seeing in the work I'm trying to do at the moment?
I think one of the things that I've always noted in my own work is it's not necessarily that you need any one specific sort of person in order to be able to do the task required to produce software or to produce a cookie or to produce a book. It's that you can have someone who's an incredibly intelligent and capable person who can understand all aspects of the process, but the context switch hit in order to be able to do all of them effectively is just too high. And then inevitably one aspect is going to not get as much attention and is going to not be as awesome as some of the other aspects. And while that's just reality, what I find happens, again, I am unburdened by being a developer of software, but one of the observations that I've made is when we talk about maintainer burnout, particularly maintainers of projects that are not corporate backed, is I feel like a lot of that burnout stems from the high level context switch hit of I have to deal with squishy human problems. I have to make sure that this particular release gets out. I need to fix these critical bugs. I also need to answer all of these questions on a user forum and it's not just that there are so many tasks to do. It's that the ways in which the brain must function to do each of those tasks well is quite different. And, eventually it catches up with you that your brain is being pulled in many different directions. And I feel like one of the ways in which we don't think about sustaining open source projects is by providing resourcing to projects that involves having people have enough friends, family, volunteers, paid coworkers, et cetera, to stand by their side and to focus on the tasks that they are good at doing, maybe that they enjoy less, or that give them that high context switch hit so that they can focus in on the parts that are most fulfilling to them and let other folks take on the parts that are deeply fulfilling to them, and heaven forfend work together in a community.
Yeah, and I think that's advice that I would give to most maintainers is let somebody come in and help with the low risk, high reward kind of tasks. We saw with VXZ backdoor earlier this year that you have to be careful about who you hand the keys to the kingdom over to. But things like issue triage, like somebody can come in and be a jerk in the comments, and that clearly is reputational damage to your community. But by and large, the worst thing that happens is an issue gets miscategorized, mislabeled, whatever. That's a thing that can be fixed and people will learn. But if you've got a lot of issues coming in because people are using your software, like, hey, that's good, right? But just that alone weighs. A lot of times it's like the same question or the same bug report over and over again. And you're like, I just want to sit down and write some code. And in business context, they talk about like you have technical founders and they start a company. And at some point they have to decide, do I want to be the CEO and never write a line of code again? Or do I want to be more like a CTO or like a VP of engineering? And open source projects in a way are kind of the same thing. You might sit down and start this thing because you needed a library to do whatever. And people found it and they found it useful and more people are using it and your community is growing. And then at some point it's okay, do I want to keep writing code or do I want to give up writing code and lead the community and handle all the organizational and administrative and human parts? And once again, there's not a right answer there. It's not, well, if you start an open source project and it becomes successful, you must let somebody else take over. I did this because I want to write code. All right, well, then somebody else needs to come in and help with the human burden. On the other hand, if you're like, I'm actually super motivated by the community, I'm happy to bring in new contributors and eventually they take over 90% of the code, then cool. But again, like it comes back to being intentional about that decision and being aware that you're making a choice.
Absolutely. And this always reminds me of the often lamented situation that I hear from friends who are software developers that they really love writing code, but it seems like the career progression track is heading more into the squishy human problems by managing people. And maybe they're really good managing people and helping people grow and develop themselves and managing squishy human problems, but that's not the thing they're passionate about. The thing that they're passionate about is software development and having the brain cycles to be able to do that context switch hit, being hands-on technical and hands-on with human systems engineering ends up being something that is a difficult burden. And many people find that it's not what they want to do. They go back to doing software development or they decide, maybe the technology side gets a little bit more rusty and they really focus on the human element development and go from there. Friend, we are coming up on 10 minutes left in the podcast, and there is one important topic that we promised we would touch on, but I think it's a long topic. So maybe we keep our thoughts brief and maybe do a follow-up episode if we have amazing things to say, maybe get a panel of folks to talk about this. You've noted that it's interesting that it seems like corporations are changing their approach to open source software or even abandoning it because we see a proliferation of software code-based licensing changes. We see layoffs in industry OSPOs or just layoffs in our sister profession, developer relations, folks who focus again on communities. I have lots of thoughts. I would like to hear your thoughts.
I also have lots of thoughts. I don't want to say that it's our fault, but I think maybe we got sort of focused on the openness as the end goal and the good part. And like, oh yeah, of course, we don't need to justify in a business context all these things we're doing because we know it's the right thing to do. It's good. And when interest rates are near zero, that's fine because money is free. As soon as money stopped being free, there was a sudden shift and all of a sudden budgets got tight and we had to justify things. And I don't know that we have done a good job in showing the business value of open source as anything more than a cost center that we do to maybe try and address a few things or to be a recruitment tool for developers and a marketing engine. I think about software supply chain security right now. I think about that a lot because that's the company I work for, what we do. And what are companies going to do if the open source software that they rely on is of low quality, is compromised, stops being maintained one day? The world's economy runs on open source. Open source is how the economic engine of 2024 works. Companies do not invest in it accordingly, either as consumers or as producers. And so we need to be very clear that open source isn't just this thing that we do to get good reputation. Like, it is foundational to the business, whether the business is producing software or the business is baking cookies or the business is building cars. Every company is a software company these days. I think my barber is like the only exception because they still do all their appointments via phone and in a notebook. But everyone else is using software for something. And people need to understand that open source isn't just this free resource they extract from. I hate to get back down to the angst again, but we've seen how well we do with, hey, we can't just keep extracting resources without consideration of the future. And when it comes to physical resources, but maybe this time it'll be different because the resources we're extracting from are people and people have voices, and maybe we can push back on that. And maybe we can get people, now that open source has been around a long time, we can start getting more people with that experience into higher levels of management on corporate boards, things like that, and start representing that viewpoint. But I think that may be the most valuable thing that foundations can do right now. Yes, paying developers, paying for infrastructure, that's all great. That is important. Don't stop doing that. But also, like, talk to boardrooms, talk to C-suites, make it very clear the value to them as a business investing in and helping sustain open source software.
Absolutely. I have some rather uncharitable remarks to make about the fact that it seems to me that it was not just the loss of free money that seems to have prompted divestment in open source communities, which, by the way, I don't feel most corporations were investing in sufficiently to begin with, even when money was free. And again, this is not a conspiracy theory. This is just an observation of the timing and how it was unfortunate. Right around the same time that we saw the end of the free money era, we also saw a very clear signal from government bodies that simply saying that your technology is open source or that you actively participate and engage in open source communities was no longer a sufficient answer to avoid deeper scrutiny of business practices or of particular technological use cases. And as we started to see legislation like the Cyber Resilience Act coming out of Europe, we at the same time saw companies saying, oh, I guess this open source thing is not something we're going to invest in as much. And I'm like, oh, yeah, because it's not your get out of jail free card for hoovering up all the world's data and doing weird stuff with it. All right. Not that I have opinions that maybe I should not express here, but I don't care because I am on vacation. So I am feeling a little salty. So I'm going to be salty today. Maybe salty is better than angsty. What do you think?
Yeah, I think a little bit of salt, it's important. You got to have some to keep your body functioning, keep your electrolyte levels right. So mix a little salt in with the angst, and you've got a nice cocktail.
All right. My dear friend, Ben, as we are heading into the last moments of our recording, there is a really cool thing we do at the end of each episode, and that is called Spotlight. And on our Spotlight, we share something that has provided value or an impact on our personal career or life. In general, the goal of Spotlights is to draw attention to and show gratitude to those projects, things, project maintainers, etc. This is to show gratitude and to end on a note of sweetness to go along with our salty angst. Who's your spotlight today?
My spotlight is the WeeWX project. So this is a open source tool for pulling data off of home weather stations and producing pretty graphs and tables and stuff. So I bought a weather station a few years ago when I had a influx of money, and it's mounted up on a pole in my yard. And so I was like, all right, I need some software to do something with it. And I found WeeWX, and so every minute, I have a little server in my basement that regenerates graphs of the temperature and pressure and humidity inside and outside. And there are days where I just sit there and click refresh and watch the graph change. Cold front comes through and you get like a 10-degree Fahrenheit drop from 1 minute to the next. And has it changed my life in a way that would I do things differently if this wasn't around? Probably not, but it brings joy. And we need that in the world. And the community is super welcoming. The primary communication is a mailing list, which I appreciate. And people all over the world helping each other. The developers are super helpful and responsive. People have made different skins to make fancy views of it, and they share those with each other under open source licenses. And it's just a really great community, and it's a lot of fun and ties back into what I spent my undergraduate career thinking about.
The thing that I love about being a participant in open source communities is all of the super cool things that have nothing to do with software that all of your friends nerd out about. Thank you. That was bliss. And when you come to visit me in Germany one day, I'm going to show you all of the amazing home weather stations that like literally everybody has. And you can get them at the Aldi from $6 every 6 months. It's amazing. You'll love them. You will take them home. You will tinker with them. My spotlight is on the great city of Berlin, Germany, a hotbed of open source software development and other thinkings on all things technology and human rights. I'm going to be going there to do nothing and hang out by a pool and enjoy the beauty of the city and not think about computers and visit friends and have great joy, so that when I am done, I can return to thinking about all things sustainability and technology, feeling sweet and salty, but perhaps less angsty. Ben, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really, really appreciate your time and sharing your thoughts with us. Folks who have listened to this wonderful show, it is time for me to give you all of the details that you need about getting in touch with us, subscribing, and all of that good stuff. So if you need to get in touch with us, please email us at podcast@sustainoss.org and give us your feedback. We read every incoming mail and respond to all of them. You can rate us on Apple Podcast or Spotify. We would love a good rating. But if you think we were terrible, you should be honest about it. You can follow us on Twitter or X or whatever the thing that goes out through the universe on @sustainoss. You can join our discourse forum at discourse.sustainoss.org, and you can find more episodes and the show notes at sospodcast.sustainoss.org. Have a wonderful time, nice humans who are listening to this podcast, and we will see you on our very next episode.